The silence in my own hallway didn't just feel empty anymore. It felt like jagged glass pressing against my skin, cold and unforgiving. I'm standing here, my back pressed against the textured floral wallpaper of the corridor. The same wallpaper Bill and I had painstakingly picked out 30 years ago when the kids were still small enough to leave sticky handprints on the wainscoting. My fingers are gripping the plastic handles of a grocery bag so hard that the thin plastic is cutting deep. White welts into my palms, but I barely feel the sting. The smell of the rain on my wool coat, damp and earthy, is mixing with the rich, savory scent of the pot roast Margaret, my own daughter, is cooking in my kitchen. The clock in the foyer ticks with a heavy metallic thud, sounding less like a timepiece and more like a gavel rhythmically announcing my expiration date. But I can't move. I can't breathe. Because through the slightly ajar oak door of the kitchen, I hear them. My children. They aren't talking about my recovery from the heart scare last month that left me breathless and terrified in the CCU. They aren't talking about my upcoming 72nd birthday, or the prize-winning peonies I wanted to replant this spring. They are planning my funeral. The mahogany casket is an unnecessary expense, honestly. David's voice cuts through the warm air of the kitchen. It's a clinical boardroom voice, the one he uses when he's calculating profit margins for his investment firm. My David. My firstborn. The boy I stayed up with for 3 weeks straight when he had the croup, rocking him until my own knees went numb and my voice was a ghost of a whisper. Mom always liked oak anyway. It's cheaper, and once it's in the ground, who's going to know the difference? We need to think about the estate taxes, Margaret. Every penny we save on the service is a penny more for the grandkids' college funds. We have to be practical. She's 72. It's not like she's going to have a 500-person gala at the cathedral. If you love honest family stories that get to the heart of the truth, stay with me and subscribe. I'm sharing this because I know I'm not the only one who has felt invisible in their own home. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, which city or state. I'd love to know I'm not alone in this. I feel a cold sweat break out across my upper lip, despite the warmth of the radiator nearby. I look down at the gallon of milk in my bag. The condensation is slippery like the skin of a fish. I had gone out to get this specifically because David mentioned he wanted milk for his afternoon coffee. I had braved the drizzle and the nagging ache in my hip just to make sure he was comfortable. And there he was, debating the price of the box he wanted to put me in. I just want to know who gets the master suite, Margaret's voice follows. It's light, airy, as if she's discussing a new pair of shoes rather than the bedroom where I spent 35 years with their father. The room where I cried for months after Bill died, clutching his pillow until the scent of his cologne finally faded into nothingness. The lighting in there is perfect for my home office. Those south-facing windows are wasted on a bedroom for an old woman who barely keeps the curtains open. And we really should settle on the lilies for the service. Roses are too cliché for someone as traditional as Mom. Lilies are cheaper if we buy them through the hospital florist I know from my nursing days. It's about being efficient. Efficient. That word felt like a physical slap across my face. I stood there for 10 minutes, the grocery bag feeling like it was filled with lead weights instead of peaches and bread. My hands were shaking so violently that the peaches rattled against the plastic, a small rhythmic thud that sounded like a drumbeat in the oppressive silence of the hallway. I felt a surge of nausea. These were the people I had built my entire existence around. I remembered working double shifts at the county hospital for 35 years as a head nurse. I remembered the way my ankles would swell until they hung over the edges of my white nursing shoes. I remembered taking the graveyard shift for years just so I could be home to make them a hot breakfast before the school bus arrived. I remembered the first Social Security check I ever received, and how I had immediately put half of it into a savings account for Margaret's daughter's dental work. I had been their safety net, their ATM, their cook, and their silent observer. And now, while I was still drawing breath and feeling the warmth of the radiator against my calves, they were picking over my bones like vultures in a high-end desert. We need to get her to sign that updated power of attorney by Friday, David continued. I heard the sound of a chair scraping against the linoleum, the same linoleum I'd scrubbed on my hands and knees after their childhood birthday parties. The lawyer said if she's not of sound mind, it gets complicated. But if we do it now, while she's still grateful for us checking in on her every weekend, the transition will be seamless. We can have the house on the market by next month. I've already spoken to a developer friend of mine. He says the lot alone is worth $300,000 if we tear down this drafty old place. Tear it down. The house Bill built with his own hands during the summer of '74. The house where the growth chart of their heights is still etched into the pantry door frame. David's marks in blue pen, Margaret's in red. The house where I've spent every Christmas since 1975. The word grateful hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I wasn't a person to them anymore. I was a hurdle. An asset to be liquidated. A set of keys to be handed over to a realtor in a sharp suit. They weren't checking on me because they loved me. They were checking on me to see how much longer the problem would persist. I thought about the last heart attack. David had been so attentive at the hospital. He had sat by my bed holding my hand, telling me I needed to let them take care of things. I had been so touched. I had felt so lucky to have such devoted children. Now, looking back through the lens of this kitchen conversation, I realized he wasn't holding my hand to comfort me. He was checking for a pulse to see if the inheritance was ready for harvest. I didn't enter the kitchen. I didn't let them see my tears, though they were hot and stinging as they tracked through the wrinkles on my cheeks. I quietly turned around, my sneakers squeaking softly on the hardwood I'd polished just last Saturday. I walked back out the front door, the heavy damp air of the porch hitting me like a cold towel. I set the groceries down on the porch swing. The milk would spoil in the humid air, but the thought of it mattered as little to me as my life did to them. I got into my old Buick. The interior smelled of peppermint and old leather. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. A frantic thump-thump, thump-thump that reminded me I was still very much alive, despite their best efforts to bury me. My mind, usually clouded with the fog of age and medication, was suddenly terrifyingly clear. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the world in sharp, cruel edges. I drove. I didn't really have a destination at first. I just needed to be away from the house that no longer felt like a home. I drove past the park where I taught them to ride bikes, the skin on my shin still bearing the faint scars of the pedals. I drove past the library where I'd spent countless hours helping Margaret with her history projects. Every landmark felt like a lie. Every memory was being rewritten in real time. I pulled over near the old county recorder's office, the red brick building looking stark against the gray sky, and just sat there. My breath fogged up the windshield, blurring the world outside until it looked as messy as my heart felt. What had I done wrong? I'd followed the rules of motherhood. I'd been the good woman. I'd sacrificed my hobbies, my travel plans, and my peace to ensure they had a head start. I thought that by giving them everything I was building a bond. Instead, I had built a sense of entitlement so large it had eclipsed their humanity. I had raised adults who saw their mother's life as a countdown clock to a payday. But I didn't know what was coming next. I reached into the glove compartment, my hand brushing against old napkins and an expired insurance card. I dug deeper until I found what I was looking for. A small tattered leather pouch. Inside was the business card of Arthur Vance. Arthur had been my husband's lawyer and a dear friend for 40 years. He'd been telling me for months to tighten up my will, especially after he saw how David was handling my husband's estate. "They're good kids, Arthur," I told him over tea last November, smiling like a fool. "They don't need a legal leash. They're my babies." Arthur had just looked at me with those tired, knowing eyes and sighed. He knew. Everyone probably knew except me. How wrong I was. They weren't babies. They were grown, calculating adults who viewed their mother as a line item on a spreadsheet, an inconvenience wrapped in a cardigan. I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over the contact for Margaret. She'd probably be wondering where the milk was by now. She'd probably be annoyed that I wasn't there to take the roast out of the oven. I felt a surge of guilt, that old ingrained mom guilt, that had kept me a prisoner for decades. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a practical discussion. But then I heard David's voice again in my head, cold and metallic. "Who's going to know the difference?" The guilt vanished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve I hadn't felt since I was a young woman fighting for a head nurse position in a male-dominated hospital ward back in the '70s. I called Arthur's office. "Arthur? It's Martha Miller," I said, my voice steadying. "I need to come in. Right now. I'm in the parking lot of the recorder's office. I'll be at your door in 5 minutes." "I'm here, Martha." "What's happened?" "I heard them, Arthur. I heard the vultures. I need you to cancel all my existing directives. Every single one. And Arthur? Bring the heavy-duty shredder. We're starting from scratch. I'll have the coffee ready, he said, and the line went dead. I pulled back into traffic, the late afternoon sun finally hitting my eyes through a break in the clouds. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back had more wrinkles than she used to, and her hair was a soft snowy silver, but her eyes were finally wide open. I saw a strength there I hadn't used in a long time. It was the strength of a woman who had nothing left to lose because she had already lost the only thing that mattered, the illusion of her children's love. Little did I know this was just the beginning. They wanted to plan a funeral? Fine. They were about to find out that the person they were trying to bury was the old, passive, grateful Martha. The new Martha was very much alive, and she was about to change the game entirely. But as I pulled into the lawyer's parking lot, a black SUV, David's obsidian-colored beast of a vehicle, pulled in right behind me, blocking my exit. My heart dropped into my stomach. Had they been tracking my phone? My throat tightened as the driver's side door of the SUV opened slowly, and out stepped my son, his face a mask of false concern that I could finally see right through. "Mom," he said, tapping on the glass with his heavy gold ring. "What are you doing here? Margaret is worried sick. Why aren't you answering your phone?" I looked at him, and for the first time in my life I didn't feel like a mother. I felt like a judge. "I'm busy, David. Go home." I rolled up the window, turned off the engine, and walked into Arthur's office without looking back. Behind me I heard him shouting, but for the first time in 35 years I wasn't listening. The heavy oak door of Arthur's office clicked shut behind me, muffled the sound of David's shouting, but the vibration of his anger seemed to linger in the air. I stood in the small carpeted foyer, my breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The air in here smelled of old vellum, floor wax, and the faint, comforting scent of Arthur's pipe tobacco. It was a smell of stability, of rules, of a world where words actually meant something. "Martha? Good Lord, woman, you look like you've been through a war zone," Arthur said, stepping out from his inner office. He looked exactly the same as he had 5 years ago, suspenders stretched over a sturdy belly, a wreath of white hair, and eyes that had seen every dirty trick in the legal book. He took one look at my trembling hands and the way I was leaning against the coat rack for support, and his expression softened instantly. "Come in. Sit. Sarah, get Mrs. Miller some tea, the strong stuff. And Sarah? Lock the front door. We don't need any surprises from the parking lot." I let out a breath I'd been holding since I left my kitchen. "Locking the door is a very good idea, Arthur. David is outside. He's not going to like why I'm here. He thinks I'm having a disorienting episode." That's the word they're using now. Practical words for cold hearts. If you're still with me, thank you for listening to a grandmother's heartache. It's not easy to admit when the people you raise turn out to be strangers, but sometimes the truth is the only thing that can save you. If you've ever felt betrayed by those closest to you, stay with me. This is where the investigation begins. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I need to know I'm not standing in this hallway alone. Tell me in the comments, have you ever seen a family member's true colors only when money was involved? I sank into the heavy green velvet armchair in Arthur's office. It was a room that felt like a sanctuary. On the walls were photos of Arthur and Bill from their days in the Lions Club. Seeing Bill's face, so honest, so kind, with that little crinkle at the corners of his eyes, made my throat tighten. He would have been heartbroken to see what his children had become. Or maybe he would have been like me, furious. "He tried to stop me in the parking lot, Arthur," I said, my voice finally finding its footing. "He told me I was crazy for leaving the groceries on the porch. He's already building the case that I'm losing my mind. But the truth is, I've never seen things more clearly. I heard them. David and Margaret. They were picking out my casket. Oak because mahogany is unnecessary. They were deciding who gets my bedroom for an office while I'm still breathing. They were talking about bulldozing the house for townhomes. My home, Arthur. Our home." Arthur sat back, his chair groaning under his weight. He didn't look surprised. That was the most painful part. He didn't look surprised at all. He looked at me with a profound, weary sadness. "I've been watching the accounts, Martha. I'm glad you finally heard it for yourself as much as it hurts. I couldn't tell you legally without your request, but I've been worried. David has been asking me questions for months, questions about power of attorney, about incapacity clauses, about how one might streamline an estate for an aging parent. I told him to talk to you, but I knew he wouldn't. He was looking for a back door. He's had secondary access to my savings since the bypass, I whispered, the realization feeling like a cold stone in my gut. He said it was to make sure the hospital bills were paid on time so I wouldn't have to worry. I thanked him for it. I actually thanked him for taking the burden off my shoulders. Let's look at that burden, shall we? Arthur said, his voice turning professional and cold. He signaled to his paralegal, Sarah, who brought in a stack of folders. I did some preliminary digging when David started sniffing around my office last month. I think you need to see the paper trail your devoted son has been leaving while you were recovering. The next 3 hours were a descent into a nightmare I hadn't known I was living. Arthur spread the bank statements across the mahogany desk. And as we went through the transactions, the betrayal moved from a kitchen conversation to a calculated, long-term theft. It was like looking at a medical chart of a disease that had been spreading while the patient was asleep. There were withdrawals I didn't recognize, $5,000 here, $3,000 there. They were labeled home maintenance or medical consultant fees. But I knew for a fact my roof hadn't been fixed in years, and my only consultant was my cardiologist, Dr. Aris, whose bills were covered entirely by my insurance and Medicare. What is this, Arthur? I pointed to a transfer of $12,000 from 6 months ago, just after I came home from the hospital. That, Arthur said, his finger tracing the line with grim precision, went into an escrow account for a luxury car lease. David's business took a hit last year, Martha. A significant one. He's been using your emergency fund to maintain his image. He didn't want the country club crowd or his partners to know he was struggling. He's been living off your 35 years of nursing shifts. I felt a surge of raw, cold fury. That money was my life's blood. That was the money I had earned on those long nights in the ER when my back felt like it was breaking, when I was cleaning up after patients and skipping lunch just to save for a rainy day so I wouldn't be a burden to my children. David had taken it to pay for a car he didn't need, all while telling me I needed to simplify my life to save money. That's when everything changed, I said, my voice like a gavel hitting a block. I should have seen the signs. The way he always insisted on helping with the mail. The way Margaret kept suggesting I sell my grandmother's jewelry now, while the market is high. They weren't worried about my heart failing. They were worried the money would run out before I did. It gets worse, Arthur said, hesitating for a moment. He pulled out a document from the bottom of the stack. A document with the county recorder's seal on it. This is a draft for a deed transfer. It's not signed yet, but it's ready. It would move the title of your home into a private corporation David controls. He just needs your signature on that power of attorney this Friday. He told me you were eager to settle your affairs. Once you sign that, Martha, you don't own a brick of that house anymore. You'd be a guest in your own life, subject to eviction at his whim. I looked at the document. My name was typed there in cold black ink, right next to a line for a signature that would have ended my independence forever. I thought of the growth chart on the pantry door. I thought of the rose bushes Bill had planted for our anniversary. To David it was just the lot. To Margaret it was the office. What she said next made my blood run cold. I thought as I remembered Margaret's voice in the kitchen. I just want to know who gets the master suite. She wasn't just waiting for me to die. She was already measuring the windows for her curtains. I want it all gone, Arthur, I said, leaning forward until I was eye to eye with him. The access to my accounts, cut it off. Today. Right now. I want every penny moved to a new bank they don't even know exists. And the will. I want to rewrite it from the first sentence to the last. I want to leave them exactly what David suggested for my casket. The bare minimum. Oh. Snatched from the bottom of the pile. What do you want to do with the estate, Martha? If not them, then who? You have a significant legacy here. I don't know yet, I admitted, a raw vulnerability creeping into my voice. I just know it won't be them. I worked 35 years for this. I earned this peace. If they want to be practical and efficient, then I will be the most practical woman they've ever met. But as Arthur began to type, my phone started buzzing incessantly on the desk. It was a frantic vibration that made the wood hum. It was Margaret. Then a text from David. Then another from Margaret. "Mom, where are you? We're at the house. The police are here. We reported the Buick stolen because we were so worried. Please call us immediately." My stomach dropped. They called the police, Arthur. They're claiming I stole my own car to create a record of confusion. "It's a classic tactic," Arthur said, not looking up from his screen, his fingers flying over the keys. "They're trying to create a police report that says you're disoriented or unstable. If they have a record of you wandering or acting erratically, it makes their case for guardianship much stronger in court. They're trying to trap you, Martha. They're playing for keeps." I looked out the window. The sun was setting, casting long skeletal shadows across the parking lot. I felt like a hunted animal in my own town. But for the first time in my life, I realized that a cornered mother is the most dangerous thing in the world. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was a woman who had been robbed. I should have seen the signs. I whispered to the empty office. I remembered how Margaret always offered to organize my heart medication, and how she'd look disappointed, just for a split second, when I told her I'd already taken them and was feeling fine. She wasn't checking on my health. She was waiting for a lapse. "I'm not going back there tonight, Arthur," I said. "I can't look at them. If I look at them, I might give away the game before the papers are filed and the bank accounts are secured. I need to be a ghost for a night." "Stay at the motel by the courthouse," Arthur suggested. "I'll have Sarah drive you. We'll leave your car here in our secure garage so David thinks you're still inside. Let them wait. Let them wonder. Let them explain to the police why they reported a car stolen that is parked at their mother's attorney's office." As I walked out the back exit of the office, leaving my Buick behind like a decoy in the shadows, I felt a strange sense of auditory texture. The silence of the alleyway felt thick, like it was pressing against my eardrums. Every footstep I took on the gravel sounded like a clock ticking down to a confrontation that would change my life forever. I spent the night in a room that smelled of industrial lemon cleaner and old carpet. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the flickering neon sign of the diner across the street. I thought about the thousands of meals I'd cooked for them, the thousands of times I put their needs before mine. Skipping new coats, canceling my own doctor appointments, working through the flu just to make sure they had a head start. I felt a deep hollow grief, not for myself, but for the children I thought I had raised. I realized then that I had been loving ghosts. The David and Margaret I loved didn't exist anymore. They had been replaced by these strangers who saw me as an obstacle to their comfort. But I didn't know what was coming next. While I was sitting in that motel room, David was at my house going through my desk, looking for the very card I had used to call Arthur. He was tearing through my life, looking for a way to lock the door. Around 2 a.m. my phone buzzed one last time. It was an email alert from my home security system. Someone was trying to change the master passcode on my front door lock. Someone was trying to lock me out of the house bill I had built. "They're locking me out," I whispered to the dark room, my voice trembling but my heart hardening like steel. The investigation was over. The layers of deception were stripped bare. It wasn't just about a casket anymore. It was a battle for my very existence. But as I gripped the cluster of keys in my pocket, the keys to a house they were currently trying to steal, I felt a cold, calm clarity settle over me. They thought I was an old woman who wanted to believe her children loved her. They thought that was my weakness. But they forgot one thing: I was a head nurse. I knew how to handle a crisis. I knew how to stay calm when everything was bleeding. And I knew exactly how to cut out a tumor before it killed the patient. The motel room felt like a tomb. The flickering neon sign from the diner across the street casting rhythmic, sickly blue shadows across the ceiling. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the scrape of that chair in my kitchen and David's clinical voice debating the price of my mahogany casket. My heart was thumping. Not with the flutter of a medical condition, but with the steady, heavy beat of a woman who had finally run out of excuses for the people she loved. By 6 a.m., I was standing in front of the motel mirror, adjusting my collar. My hands were finally still. I looked at the silver-haired woman in the glass, the woman who had spent 35 years as a head nurse, holding the hands of the dying and the terrified. I realized I had been treating my children like patients for years, trying to fix their greed with more love, trying to heal their selfishness with more sacrifice. But you can't heal a heart that doesn't want to beat for anyone but itself. If you've ever had to stand your ground when people tried to make you feel crazy, just to control you, stay with me. This is the moment the tide turns. Hit that like button if you believe in standing up for yourself, and subscribe to see how I handled the confrontation that came next. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to cut someone out for your own survival? I'd love to know. I'm not alone in this. I called Arthur at 7 a.m. My voice didn't tremble. Is it done, Arthur? Is the gate locked? The new will is signed, witnessed, and notarized, Martha. Arthur's voice was like a steady anchor in a storm. The bank has frozen the old accounts and moved every cent to the private trust. David's access is gone. But Martha, be careful. He called my office 6 times this morning starting at 6 a.m. He's frantic. He knows the ATM has been shut off, and he's going to be looking for someone to blame. I'm going home, Arthur. I'm going to deliver the news in person. I want to see their faces when they realize the old woman isn't as confused as they hoped. I didn't take a taxi. I had Sarah from Arthur's office drop me off a block away from my house. I wanted to walk. I wanted to feel the pavement of my neighborhood under my feet one last time as the old Martha. The morning air was crisp, smelling of damp leaves, wood smoke, and the faint hint of winter. As I turned the corner, I saw them. Both cars, David's black SUV and Margaret's silver sedan, were parked haphazardly in my driveway, blocking the sidewalk. They were already treating my property like a parking lot for their own convenience. I walked up the porch steps. The groceries I'd left the day before, the milk and the peaches, were gone, likely tossed in the trash by Margaret, who probably complained about the mess I'd made. I didn't use my key. I didn't want to sneak in like a thief in the night. I rang my own doorbell. I rang it long and hard. The door flew open. David stood there, his tie undone, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with a manic energy. Behind him, Margaret was pacing the foyer, a cup of coffee in her hand, my favorite mug, the one Bill gave me for our 25th anniversary. Seeing her hold it felt like a violation. "Where the hell have you been?" David barked, his voice vibrating with a mixture of anger and genuine panic. "We spent all night with the police. We thought you'd crashed the car or had a stroke. Do you have any idea what you've put us through? We were about to call the hospitals." "I've put you through?" I walked past him into my foyer, my heels clicking like a gavel on the hardwood I had polished every Saturday for 40 years. I didn't stop until I was in the center of the living room, standing on the rug Bill and I bought with our first shared Christmas bonus. "That's interesting, David, because I think it's the other way around. I think you've put me through quite enough." "Mom, you're not making sense. You're talking in riddles," Margaret said, her voice dripping with that patronizing sweetness that used to make me feel small and fragile. "You're clearly having a manic episode. We've already called Dr. Eris. We're going to take you to the clinic, and then we're going to get your affairs in order so this never happens again. We can't have you wandering off." She reached out to touch my arm, her fingers cold, but I pulled back as if her skin were red-hot coal. "I've already put my affairs in order, Margaret. That's why I was with Arthur yesterday. I was cleaning house." The room went deathly quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, and the distant hum of a neighbor's leaf blower. David's face shifted from concerned son to predator in a split second. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. "What did you do, Martha?" he whispered, using my first name for the first time in his life. "I heard you," I said, my voice rising, filling the room I had spent decades cleaning, decorating, and loving. "I heard you in the kitchen yesterday. I stood in that hallway for 10 minutes while you debated the price of my mahogany casket. I heard about the oak. I heard about Margaret's home office in my bedroom. I heard about the developer and the $300,000 you wanted for the lot, my husband's lot. I heard every cold, calculating word." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She dropped her spoon, and it hit the floor with a sharp, echoing clink. "Mom, we were just talking about the future. You have to be realistic. You're old, you've had a heart scare, you're vulnerable. I am 72 years old, not dead." I shouted, the fury finally erupting out of me like steam from a pressure cooker. "I spent 35 years in the trenches of a hospital so you could have the best of everything. I sold my mother's vintage lace and her emeralds to pay for your wedding, Margaret. I took out a second mortgage on this very house to save your failing business 10 years ago, David. And you had the audacity to stand in my kitchen and pick over my belongings while the pot roast I paid for was still warm on the stove. You're being melodramatic, David snapped, stepping toward me, trying to use his height and his expensive suit to intimidate me. The reality is you can't manage this estate anymore. You're one heart attack away from a nursing home. And we are trying to manage the transition so we don't lose the value of the property to the state. It's practical, Martha. It's business. It's about the family's future. Business. I felt a cold, sharp laugh bubble up in my throat. Is that what I am to you? A business transaction? A depreciating asset that needs to be liquidated? What she said next made my blood run cold. I thought as I looked at Margaret, who was now dabbing at her eyes. Real tears or practice ones, I didn't care anymore. The maternal bond that had held me hostage for decades had finally snapped. David is right, Mom, Margaret sobbed, her voice trembling with a forced fragility. It's too much for you here. We already contacted the Willows. It's a beautiful facility. They have a communal garden and 24-hour staff. We can't keep coming over here every weekend to check your vitals and make sure you haven't fallen down the stairs. We have lives. We have children. You're being selfish by clinging to this house. Selfish. I whispered. The word felt like a physical weight in the air. I have given you every drop of my life. I have been your bank, your nanny, and your emotional punching bag. And the one time I asked to keep my own home and my own dignity, I'm selfish? Enough, David said, reaching for his leather briefcase on the sofa. He pulled out a stack of legal papers. You're going to sign the power of attorney right now. We've already talked to a judge about an emergency petition. If you don't sign this, we'll have you declared incompetent. We have the police report from last night. We have your medical records. We have your erratic behavior. Don't make us do this the hard way, Mom. Sign the papers. I looked at the papers. I looked at the son I had birthed, the boy I had tucked in every night for 18 years, the boy whose scraped knees I had kissed. I realized then that he didn't love me. He didn't even see me as a human being. He saw a pile of money shaped like a woman in a cardigan. I'm not signing anything, David, I said, pulling 2 manila envelopes from my bag. I dropped them on the coffee table. The sound was heavy, final, like a door closing forever. But you are. You're signing for these. What is this? Margaret asked, her hand trembling as she reached for one. Inside those envelopes are eviction notices, I said, my voice as hard as flint. Margaret, you've been using the guest cottage as your art studio for 3 years without paying a cent of rent or utilities. You have 30 days to vacate. David, I've already contacted the bank regarding the $12,000 in medical fees you stole for your luxury car lease. That's fraud, David. I've filed a formal report with the county sheriff and the bank's fraud department. You have 30 days to repay the loan, or I press charges. David's face turned a ghostly mottled shade of purple. You wouldn't. I'm your son. You're destroying my reputation. A son doesn't steal from his mother's heart surgery fund to drive a Mercedes. I screamed, the sound echoing through the house. A son doesn't plan his mother's funeral while she's in the next room. You want to talk about practicality? Fine. Practically speaking, you are both cut out. The will has been changed. The house is being moved into a trust. You will get exactly what you earned. That oak casket you were so fond of. And not a single cent more. Margaret wailed, a high, thin sound that set my teeth on edge. You're destroying this family. Over one conversation? How could you be so cruel after everything we've done for you? I'm not destroying this family, Margaret, I said, walking to the front door and throwing it wide. The morning sun poured into the foyer, highlighting the dust motes in the air, the dust of a life that was finally being cleared out. The family died in that kitchen yesterday. I'm just the only one who had the decency to realize it was time to bury it. You'll regret this, David hissed, grabbing his briefcase so hard the leather groaned. He looked at me with a hatred so pure it made my stomach drop, but I didn't flinch. You'll be alone in this big, drafty house, and when you have your next heart attack, don't bother calling us. You wanted your independence? You got it. Enjoy the silence. I survived 35 years of their David, I said as he marched past me. I've seen death every day for decades. I think I can survive the silence of two vultures leaving my porch. They left, their tires screeching on the asphalt of the driveway, leaving behind a silence that was suddenly shockingly peaceful. I leaned against the door after I locked the deadbolt, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked around my living room. The photos on the mantel, the curtains I'd sewn by hand, the rug Bill and I had bought on our honeymoon. It all looked different now. It was mine. Truly mine. But as I sank onto the sofa, my hands finally starting to shake as the adrenaline began to fade, I realized that the battle wasn't over. David had mentioned a judge. He'd mentioned a medical petition. He wasn't going to go quietly. He was going to try to prove I was crazy to get his hands back on the keys to the vault. But I didn't know what was coming next. I thought as I stared at the phone. I had taken their power, but I had also made them desperate. And a desperate man like David, with his back against the wall and his business failing, was capable of anything. I had 30 days until the eviction was final, but I had a feeling the next 30 hours would be the most dangerous of my life. I had to move fast. I had to find the one thing David feared more than poverty: the truth. The silence that followed the screeching of their tires was heavy, like the air in a room after a window has been smashed. I stood there, leaning my forehead against the cool wood of the front door, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock. For the first time in my life, that ticking didn't feel like a countdown to my end. It felt like a heartbeat. My heartbeat. I was 72 years old, and I was finally the only person in charge of my own breath. But the peace was a fragile, brittle thing. I knew David. He was the kind of man who viewed a no as a challenge and a boundary as an insult. He had been a high-stakes corporate negotiator for 15 years, and he didn't lose. As I walked into the kitchen to pour the cold coffee down the sink, I saw the pot roast Margaret had left behind. It sat there on the counter, the fat congealing into a white, waxy film on the surface. It looked exactly like their love. Cold, solid, and hard to swallow. If you've ever had to stand your ground when your own blood turned against you, stay with me. This is the part where the masks truly fall off and the real battle begins. Please hit that like button to show David that a mother's strength isn't something to be toyed with. And subscribe to see how I handled the trap he set next. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever had a family member try to use your own health against you? I need to know I'm not the only one fighting this fight. The phone rang at noon. I expected it to be Arthur, but the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. A local government extension. I answered it anyway, my nursing instincts always on alert for an emergency, my heart rate picking up just a fraction. Mrs. Miller? This is Detective Henderson with the county sheriff's office. A gruff, tired voice said. My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. We've received a formal request for a wellness check, combined with a report of elder self-neglect and possible cognitive decline. Your son, David, has expressed grave concern that you are unable to care for yourself and may be a danger to your own safety. He mentioned you went missing for nearly 24 hours and have begun making irrational financial decisions under duress. Irrational. I let out a sharp, dry laugh that sounded like dead leaves skittering on a sidewalk. Detective, I am a retired head nurse. I spent 35 years documenting the symptoms of cognitive decline in others. I can assure you the only thing I'm suffering from is a sudden lack of tolerance for being robbed by my own children. I am perfectly fine. I understand, ma'am, but we have to follow protocol when a family member files a sworn affidavit. There's a court-ordered emergency psychiatric evaluation scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. If you refuse to attend, your son has the legal right to request an emergency pickup for a 72-hour psychiatric observation. It's for your protection, supposedly. A 72-hour observation. He wanted to lock me in a psych ward. He wanted to sedate me, humiliate me, and use that observation as the final nail in the coffin of my independence. He wasn't just coming for my money anymore. He was coming for my very identity. He wanted to prove I was a crazy old woman, so he could sign the papers himself. I'll be there, detective, I said, my voice as steady as it was when I used to call out codes in the ER. And tell my son to bring his best suit. He's going to need it when the truth comes out. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't spend it crying. I didn't have time for tears. I spent it in the attic, surrounded by the ghosts of our family history. I sat on an old cedar trunk full of baby clothes, my hands brushing over the velvet of David's first Sunday suit and the delicate lace of Margaret's christening gown. I felt a deep, hollowing grief for the children they used to be. But I didn't let it soften my resolve. I dug through my old nursing logs and my husband Bill's hidden business files until I found the red folder. Bill had always been a meticulous man. A trait I used to find annoying but now found life-saving. He'd kept records of every loan, every gift, and every bailout we had ever provided to our children. I had forgotten about it, tucked away behind the dusty boxes of Christmas decorations and old high school yearbooks. But as I flipped through the pages by the light of a single bare bulb, the truth was even uglier than I remembered. David hadn't just borrowed money for his business. He had taken $100,000 from our retirement fund 10 years ago to settle a quiet lawsuit regarding mismanaged funds that would have sent him to prison for embezzlement. He had signed a legal confession and a promissory note to repay us, which he had promptly ignored the moment his father was in the ground. And Margaret? She had been taking allowances from my Social Security check for years, claiming it was for the grandkids' school supplies and emergency dental work, while her social media showed her on wine tours in Napa and skiing in Aspen. I should have seen the signs, I whispered to the dark, dusty attic. I was so busy being a mother that I forgot to be a person. I let them bleed me dry because I thought that's what love looked like. But I didn't know what was coming next. I thought as I packed the folder into my bag. The next morning, the courthouse felt like a cathedral of cold stone and judgment. I arrived 45 minutes early wearing my best charcoal gray suit, the one I'd bought for Bill's funeral. I looked sharp, professional, and entirely of sound mind. My silver hair was pinned back in a tight, efficient bun, and my eyes were clear. David and Margaret were already there, sitting on a polished wooden bench in the hallway like two vultures on a wire. David was whispering frantically to a lawyer in a sharp three-piece suit. When he saw me, he stood up, his face contorting into a mask of practiced, tragic pity for the benefit of the passing bailiffs. "Mom, it's not too late," he said, stepping toward me. His voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper. "Just drop the eviction notices, give me the power of attorney so I can fix the bank accounts, and we can cancel this hearing right now. We don't want to put you through the humiliation of a psych eval in front of your old colleagues. We just want you safe and cared for." "You want me silent, David?" I said, looking him dead in the eye, refusing to flinch. "There's a massive difference between safe and subdued. And I think the judge will agree." The hearing was held in a small wood-paneled room that smelled of floor wax and old paper. Judge Halloway, a woman with iron gray hair and eyes that looked like they could see through a brick wall, presided. David's lawyer spent 20 minutes painting a horrific picture of a woman slipping away. A woman who wandered off to a motel in a state of confusion, forgot to buy basic groceries, and was lashing out at her devoted caregivers with paranoid delusions of theft. Then it was my turn. Arthur stood by my side, but I asked to speak for myself. "Your Honor," I said, standing up without a single tremor in my legs. "I am a retired nurse with 35 years of experience in clinical assessment. I have here a medical evaluation performed yesterday afternoon by my own physician, Dr. Aris, who has known me for 30 years. He finds me perfectly competent. But more importantly, I have this." I laid the red folder on the table. The sound it made was like a gunshot in the small room. David's eyes widened, and he went visibly pale. "These are records of my son's financial history with me and my late husband. He is not here out of concern for my health, Your Honor. He is here because I finally stopped paying for his corporate mistakes. He owes my estate over $100,000 in unpaid loans from a previous embezzlement scandal. And he knows that the moment I die, that debt becomes due to the trust one established yesterday. He's trying to declare me incompetent so he can erase his own paper trail and seize my remaining assets before I can file a formal suit for repayment." David's lawyer tried to object, stammering about relevance, but Judge Halloway held up a single sharp hand. She began flipping through the red folder. The silence in the room was so thick you could have choked on it. I could hear Margaret's heavy, panicked breathing next to me, the sound of someone watching their golden ticket turn to ash. "And as for my daughter," I continued, my voice gaining strength with every word, "she claims I cannot care for myself. Yet, She has lived rent-free in my guest cottage for 3 years while I paid for her electricity, her water, and her children's clothing. If I am too incompetent to manage my own life, then she has been complicit in elder financial abuse for 36 months by accepting those funds. That's a lie. She's making things up. Margaret shrieked, her face turning a blotchy, ugly red that ruined her grieving daughter look. Is it? I asked, pulling out a stack of canceled checks from my purse. Because these are the checks I wrote for your art supplies that actually went to pay for your luxury country club membership and your husband's gambling debts. I have the receipts from the club, Margaret. I did my research. Judge Holloway looked up from the folder. She looked at David, then at Margaret, and then she looked at me. For a moment I saw a flicker of something that looked like deep professional respect in her eyes, one working woman recognizing another. Mr. Miller, the judge said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, low register that made the court reporter pause. This court is not a tool for your debt collection or your personal inheritance disputes. This petition for an emergency evaluation is not only denied, it is a shameful and frivolous abuse of the legal system. If you or your sister set foot on your mother's property without her express written consent from this moment forward, I will have you arrested for trespassing, harassment, and stalking. Do I make myself clear? We walked out of that courtroom. David tried to stop me at the elevators, his face twisted in a snarl. He looked smaller now, the sharp suit not enough to hide the desperation of a man who knew he was broke. You've destroyed everything, Martha, he hissed, the mom title finally discarded. You've destroyed the family name. Do you think anyone is going to visit you now? You're going to die in that drafty house alone, and nobody will even know you're gone until the smell bothers the neighbors. I was already alone in that house, David, I said, the elevator door sliding open with a soft ding. I was just the only one who didn't know it yet. At least now the house is quiet because I chose it, not because I'm being ignored by people waiting for me to pass. And as for the smell, don't worry. I've already hired a service to check on me. They're much more reliable than you. I got into the elevator and watched as the doors closed on their angry, defeated faces. I felt a surge of triumph, but as the elevator descended, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a notification from my home security app. Front door tamper alert. Motion detected in master bedroom. My heart plummeted into my shoes. David hadn't been in the courtroom the whole time. He'd been texting someone. He had a backup plan. While I was at the courthouse winning my mind back, he had sent someone to my house to take the only things I had left, the physical memories of Bill. But I didn't know what was coming next. I thought as I ran for my car, I had won the legal battle, but the war for my home was reaching its breaking point. David was desperate, and a desperate man doesn't follow court orders. He was going for the heirlooms before the locks could be changed. The ride back to the house felt like a race against a ghost. My hands were gripped so tight on the steering wheel that my knuckles looked like polished ivory, and every red light felt like a personal insult from the universe. The tamper alert on my phone glowed on the passenger seat like a warning flare. I didn't call the police immediately. I wanted to see it for myself. I wanted to see exactly how far the boy I had carried for 9 months and loved for 40 years had fallen. I needed the final undeniable proof that the bridge was not just burned, but turned to ash. As I pulled into the driveway, the sight made my blood run cold. A white unmarked moving van was parked haphazardly across my lawn, its heavy tires churning up the flower beds Bill had planted. 2 men in dirty jumpsuits were on my porch, and the front door, my heavy solid oak door that had kept my family safe for decades, was hanging open at a grotesque angle, the frame splintered and the deadbolt shattered. They weren't burglars in the traditional sense, they were scavengers. And standing there, directing them with a clipboard in her hand and a cold, clinical look in her eyes, was Margaret. "Stop right where you are," I screamed, slamming the car door so hard it echoed through the quiet suburban street like a gunshot. "Get out of my house. Get off my property. If you've stuck with me through this journey, thank you for being my witness. This story isn't just about a will or a house. It's about the moment you realize your worth isn't tied to how much you give, but how much you respect yourself. If this touched you, if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and telling the truth, I'd love to hear from you. Hit that like button, subscribe for more real stories, and tell me your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in my shoes? Margaret looked at me, her eyes devoid of any daughterly warmth, replaced by a sharp, jagged defiance. David said the hearing went poorly because you manipulated the judge, but he also said you're not thinking straight. We're just securing the family heirlooms, Mother. Before you decide to give them away to a thrift store or some stranger in one of your fits of spite. We're protecting our history. I walked up those steps, my 72-year-old legs feeling like they were made of reinforced steel. I looked past her into the foyer, and the sight broke what little was left of my heart. They had already crated the grandfather clock that had belonged to Bill's father. They had boxed up the silver tea service I'd inherited from my grandmother. They were stripping the memories off the walls like they were nothing but scrap metal. I have a court order, Margaret, I said, my voice dangerously low, vibrating with a coldness that made the movers stop in their tracks. Judge Holloway told you that if you or David set foot on this property, you'd be arrested. Those men, they're participating in a felony. If they don't put every single box back exactly where they found it and leave in 60 seconds, I'm calling the sheriff I just left at the courthouse. He's already expecting my call. The movers looked at each other, then at Margaret's trembling hands. They didn't want any part of a family bloodbath. They dropped the boxes right there on the porch. I heard the sickening crunch of porcelain breaking, and ran for their van without a word. Margaret stood there, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated greed that made her look like a stranger. You're a bitter, lonely old woman, she spat, the words dripping with venom. Enjoy your empty house. Enjoy your money. When you're gasping for air in the middle of the night and need someone to hold your hand, don't look for us. We're done. You've officially orphaned yourself. I was gasping for air in this house for years, Margaret, I said, watching her march down the steps to her car. And you only noticed when you thought my breath was costing you a mahogany casket. Go. And if I see your car on this street again, I won't call a lawyer. I'll call the precinct. I watched them drive away, the white van and her silver sedan disappearing around the corner. The neighborhood was quiet again, the birds singing in the ancient maple trees as if the world hadn't just collapsed in my foyer. I walked inside. The house was a battlefield. Boxes were overturned, the rug was kicked up, and the splintered door frame was a jagged reminder of the violence of their entitlement. I sat down on the floor in the middle of the foyer, right there on the hardwood. I didn't cry. I didn't have any tears left for them. I just sat there in the silence, feeling the weight of the 35 years I'd spent as a nurse, a wife, and a mother. I thought about the first Social Security check I'd ever gotten, the one I'd saved for Margaret's daughter's tuition. I thought about the double shifts I'd worked to pay for David's business school. It was all gone. Not the money, the meaning. I was a stranger in a museum of my own making. That's when everything changed. I whispered to the empty hallway. A week later, a letter arrived. It wasn't from a lawyer, and it didn't have a corporate seal. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope with a handwritten address. It was from Eleanor, my sister in Maine. We hadn't spoken in 15 years. Not since a bitter argument over our own mother's estate that had been fueled by the same greed I had just survived. Martha, I heard about the trouble with David and Margaret from Arthur. He called me because he was worried. I know we haven't found our way back to each other. But life is too short to die holding on to old grudges that don't matter anymore. I'm living in the cottage by the sea now. The air is salty, the garden is overgrown with lavender, and there's no one here but me and the gulls. If you want to leave that drafty house and those vultures behind, the guest room is yours. No strings. No wills. No talk of inheritance. Just sisters, a pot of tea, and the sound of the waves. I looked around my drafty house. I looked at the growth chart on the pantry door frame, the marks David and Margaret would never see again. I looked at the spot on the rug where Bill used to sit with his morning paper. I realized then that a house isn't a home if the people in it are only waiting for you to leave it, so they can sell the dirt it sits on. I did something David and Margaret never expected. I didn't keep the house out of spite. I didn't sell it to a developer to spite them either. I contacted the County Nurses Association. I donated the entire property fully furnished, to be used as a retreat for burned-out caregivers. A place where nurses who had spent their lives giving everything to others could come for a week of peace, free of charge, to recover from the exhaustion of a world that doesn't always give back. I packed 3 suitcases. I took my jewelry, The real pieces Margaret had already mentally appraised at the dinner table, and I took every single photo of Bill. Everything else I left for the nurses. I left the mahogany dining table for them to share meals. I left the master suite for them to find rest. The day I left, the sun was shining with a brilliance that felt like a blessing. I stood on the porch one last time. A young nurse, a girl no older than Margaret had been when she got married, was standing there with the keys I just handed her. Her eyes were bright with a mixture of shock and profound gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You have no idea what this means to us. We've been struggling so much lately. Place like this. It's a miracle. Why would you do this for us?" "Because I know what it's like to work until your feet bleed for people who don't say thank you," I said with a small, sad smile. "Enjoy the master suite. The lighting is perfect for reading, but it's even better for a long, undisturbed nap. And don't ever let anyone tell you that you're just a nurse." I drove away without looking back. I drove past the park, past the library, and past the courthouse where I had reclaimed my name. I drove until the suburbs turned into rolling hills, and the hills turned into the rocky, wild coast of Maine. Eleanor was waiting for me on her porch, wrapped in a thick wool cardigan. She looked older, her hair a wild mane of snowy white, but when she hugged me, she smelled like lavender, peppermint, and home. "You did it, Martha," she whispered into my ear as we stood looking at the ocean. "You finally chose yourself." "It took me 72 years and a broken door frame to do it, Eleanor," I said, watching the tide come in. "But I think I'm finally of sound mind. And for the first time in my life, I'm not waiting for someone else to tell me what I'm worth." I haven't heard from David or Margaret since that day on the porch. I heard through Arthur that they tried to sue the Nurses Association to overturn the donation, claiming I was delusional, but the judge from the hearing, Judge Halloway, personally saw to it that the case was dismissed with prejudice. They're busy living their practical lives, and I am busy living mine. I learned that blood doesn't make a family. Respect does. Loyalty does. And sometimes the most efficient thing you can do for your soul is to cut out the people who only love you for what you can leave them in a box. I'm Martha Miller and I'm finally free. If this story touched you, if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and telling your truth, I'd love to hear from you. Hit that like button, subscribe for more real stories, and tell me your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done? Would you have stayed in that house, or would you have walked away toward the sea?